Let's look at some of the big ideas in Unit 4. Let's go through the presidents first. We've got Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, and if you remember this fact, that every president in this era, in 1800 to 1848, every president who is elected and only has two names serves two full terms. Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, that's all true. John Quincy Adams, three names, only gets one term. All right, Andrew Jackson is then elected, and he serves two full terms, two names, two terms. Martin Van Buren, well, he only gets one term for that. William Henry Harrison, that's definitely three names, which is part of the reason why. Not really, but he only serves for 1 month. He dies 1 month after taking office, so John Tyler takes over. Now, he wasn't elected, so he only gets one term. And James K. Polk, if we count that K as a third name, that's why Polk only gets one term. In reality, James K. Polk did not run for re-election. Let's go back to the beginning and look at the conflicts from this time period. Guess what? You're going to be shocked. Britain was fighting France at this time, and American ships were being harassed as a result. American sailors were being impressed by the British and French Navy, pressed into service in their navies. There's also a renewal of tensions along the frontier with Native Americans, fomented by British agents, and Americans really grow to have a desire to take over all of Canada. Not all Americans, but some expansionist Americans. All of these things lead to the War of 1812. That war ends with very little change other than the United States and Britain's relationship beginning to grow into a very close, supportive relationship. Jumping ahead to Andrew Jackson, there's not an American conflict in Jackson's presidency, but there was a conflict involving some Americans living in Mexico. I'm talking about the Texas Revolution, when the state of Tejas broke away from Mexico and became independent for 9 years. Jumping ahead to James K. Polk, we're not done with Texas. In fact, Mexico and America are going to fight a war about where the border of Texas is. It was a relatively easy U.S. victory. Going back to the beginning, let's look at politics. This era begins with the same two parties we had from the last era, and that is the Federalists and Democratic Republicans. Now, the Federalist Party is going to cease to be a national, powerful political party after they do some things that really make them look like traitors during the War of 1812. So we get what's known as the era of good feelings during James Monroe's presidency, where there's only one political party, but that only lasted about one term. John Quincy Adams is elected, the nation is divided, and Andrew Jackson's supporters feel that they were wrong, that they had the election stolen from them. Jackson is later elected in 1828, takes office in 1829, and it begins what we call the era of the common man. Jackson is at the head of a party called the Jacksonian Democrats, or sometimes just the Democrats. Not everybody supported Jackson. Some people were what we call Whigs. That's the name the party chose for the group that opposed a lot of Andrew Jackson's policies. They eventually form into a more organized political party, so much so that we have what's known as our first modern election in 1840 with Martin Van Buren, the Democrat, running against Whig William Henry Harrison. It was a modern campaign in terms of the campaigning style, the amount of money spent, the slogans, the effort to turn out the vote of all Americans. Let's go back to the beginning and look at an important trend that's going to play an increasing role as we get closer and closer to the Civil War, and that is emerging sectionalism, the growing bond within the North and South, and the growing division between those two geographic regions. Let's see if we can see a trend here. Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. Now, John Quincy Adams is from Massachusetts, but he's only in office for 4 years and doesn't do a lot while in office. Then we get to Andrew Jackson. Martin Van Buren is from upstate New York. Here we've got John Tyler. and James K. Polk. The trend, Southern dominance in the White House. Of course, it would not have been possible without the 3/5 compromise giving Southerners a disproportionate amount of power in Congress, despite the fact that they didn't let black people vote. But that growing sectionalism is going to play out with certain issues that divide the nation, like the tariff. Tariffs hurt the South, tariffs help the North. That's the simplified version. And as a result, they're going to be very divisive. We're also going to see the issue of Texas come up while Jackson is president. Should Texas be admitted to the Union? Jackson was all for it, but it didn't happen while he was president. Martin Van Buren was opposed to it. He thought it would split the country, it would divide the party, it would be problematic. He said no to annexing Texas. But in the election of 1844, while John Tyler is running for re-election, James K. Polk makes adding Texas the central campaign issue. And as a result, the United States Congress actually adds Texas to the Union, and Texas becomes a state, becomes a territory and then a state, even before Polk takes office. But now the problem is the border dispute, that green area on the map, which Mexico and the United States now disagreed on. That border dispute is going to lead to the Mexican-American War during James K. Polk's presidency. America wins that war, and as a result, America grows dramatically in size, gaining all of that territory you see there labeled the Mexican Cession. This raises a big question, because what's going to happen in that huge chunk of territory? Will it be open to slavery? And if so, does that mean that the United States government just fought a war to increase slavery? Let's move now to some economic issues. Thomas Jefferson tried to avoid war with Britain and France by trying to use some very modern diplomatic efforts. The Embargo Act of 1807, which was a trade or a ban on trade with any country that was attacking American shipping. It did not actually work. In fact, it was rather unpopular. It hurt American shipping more than it ever hurt Britain or France. James Madison, leader of the Democratic Republicans. And remember how much the Democratic Republicans hated the Bank of the United States? Well, Madison lets the bank expire and die while he's president. But then he has to fight the War of 1812. And we know that wars are expensive. It's during the war that Madison has the realization, dang, it sure would be nice to have a Bank of the United States, which is why during the Democratic-Republican James Madison's presidency, Congress charters and creates the second Bank of the United States. The biggest economic issue of this era, though, is what's known as the market revolution. This is a huge change. It's a change in the distribution of goods. America's economy goes from local economies and regional markets to a national or even international markets for American trade. This is brought on a lot by changes in transportation, first with the canal boom and then shortly thereafter with railroads. The market revolution is not an industrial revolution. I would argue we do not have an industrial revolution until after the Civil War. But we do see a growth of industry. That's in large part due to farming becoming more efficient with machines like this. Farms could increase crop production despite using fewer and fewer people. Where did those extra workers go? Well, they went to the earliest factories in American history. We see the start of the factory-based industry, and first, just like with Britain, with the textile industry. As our economy becomes interconnected, becomes a national economy, that means problems become national problems, which was why in 1819 we have our first economic panic of the 1800s. In the 1800s, they called recessions panics. The tariff is again an issue moving forward, helping industry but hurting other parts of the country. Andrew Jackson comes into office and he does not like the Bank of the United States. He comes into conflict with the Bank of the United States. In fact, he declares he's going to kill the Bank of the United States, and he does just that by taking the funding out. This leads to another panic, the Panic of 1837. Finally, let's take a look at some of the changes in society that we'll cover in Unit 4, 1800 to 1848. A lot of these are related to the Second Great Awakening, which is a lot like the First Great Awakening. It was a religious rebirth in American history. It was a growth of American evangelicalism. But the big difference between the First and Second Great Awakening is that the Second Great Awakening spurred people to action. The Second Great Awakening caused reform movements like the temperance movement, which tried to get people to drink less or drink not at all, like abolition, which tried to free the slaves. Related to the Second Great Awakening is a uniquely American religious philosophy, let's call it that, and that is transcendentalism, that really emphasizes the connection between man, God, and nature. We also see a rise in this time period of romantic style art, and sometimes that's built around national themes like this, showing Oliver Hazard Perry in the Battle of Lake Erie during the War of 1812, or other American themes like Manifest Destiny that we see here.